Introduction. Consider the possibility that truth is a woman. If this were so, would we not have reason to suspect that the entire lineage of philosophers, particularly those who have operated as dogmatists, have fundamentally misunderstood their subject? There is a certain clumsy importunity and a heavy-handed seriousness with which these thinkers have historically approached truth. Perhaps these were never the right methods to win the favor of such a figure. It is quite clear that she has remained uncaptured, leaving the rigid structures of dogma to stand today with a discouraged and weary expression, if indeed they are standing at all. There are even those who mockingly suggest that these systems have already collapsed or are drawing their final, gasping breaths. In a more serious light, we might hope that the entirety of philosophical dogmatizing, for all its solemnity and air of finality, was merely a necessary stage of intellectual immaturity. We are approaching an era where we can finally examine the humble foundations upon which these massive and absolute systems were built. It may turn out that these imposing structures rested on nothing more than ancient superstitions, such as the persistent myth of the soul or the ego, or perhaps a mere misunderstanding of grammar and the deceptive nature of language. We might find that these absolute truths were simply bold generalizations based on very limited and all too human experiences. We should not, however, look back with ingratitude, just as astrology once demanded immense labor and patience, inadvertently providing the grand style of architecture in Asia and Egypt. Dogmatic philosophy has served a purpose. To leave a permanent mark on the heart of humanity, great things often must first wander the world as massive, awe-inspiring caricatures. Platonism in Europe and the Vedanta doctrine in Asia were such caricatures. While we must admit that the most dangerous and exhausting era in history was Plato's invention of pure spirit and the good in itself, the struggle against this nightmare has given us a new kind of strength. To speak of spirit and goodness as Plato did was to invert the very truth of existence and to deny the perspectival nature of life itself. One might even ask if the influence of Socrates was a kind of infection that led Plato to such a malady. Yet the millenniums of struggle against this ecclesiastical oppression, for Christianity is effectively Platonism for the masses, has created a magnificent tension within the European soul. Like a bow that has been drawn taut over centuries, we now possess an inner strain that allows us to aim at the most distant and ambitious goals. While many feel this tension as a form of distress and have tried to unbend the bow, first through the methods of Jesuitism and later through democratic enlightenment and the distractions of the press, we do not seek such relief. We who identify as good Europeans and free, very free spirits, embrace this distress and the power of this tension. We hold the arrow, we feel the duty, and perhaps we are the ones who can finally see the goal to aim at. Sils Maria, Upper Engadine, June 1885. Chapter 1. Prejudices of Philosophers. The persistent drive toward truth, which has historically commanded such profound respect among thinkers, inevitably forces us to confront deeply unsettling questions. We must pause before this enigmatic sphinx and ask ourselves who is truly demanding these answers, and what, fundamentally, is the nature of this will to truth that resides within us. Moving beyond the mere origin of this impulse, we arrive at a far more radical standstill, questioning the very value of truth itself. Why should we not prefer untruth, or perhaps even revel in uncertainty and ignorance? Traditional metaphysicians have always operated under the foundational prejudice that values exist in absolute antithesis. They cannot fathom that truth might emerge from error or selfless deeds from profound egoism. They stubbornly insist that the highest values must derive from a pure, uncorrupted thing in itself, refusing to see that their supposedly objective truths might simply be superficial frog perspectives. A daring new breed of philosophers is required to entertain the dangerous perhaps. The possibility that the very things we deem wicked or deceitful are fundamentally intertwined with and perhaps identical to the things we revere. Indeed, the falseness of a judgment is not necessarily an argument against it. What matters is whether it serves to preserve and promote life, and we must recognize that the most fundamental fictions, such as mathematical certainties and absolute realities, are utterly indispensable for human survival. To acknowledge untruth as a vital condition of life is to shatter traditional moral frameworks and step boldly beyond good and evil. The skepticism directed toward philosophers is well earned, not because they are occasionally prone to error, but because they lack genuine intellectual honesty. They posture as though their insights were birthed through the pristine, immaculate conception of pure dialectic, when in reality, they are merely acting as astute advocates for their own deeply held prejudices and heart's desires, which they conveniently label as truths. We see this tartuffery in the stiff moralism of Kant, who uses dialectical mazes to lead us toward his categorical imperative, just as we see it in the mathematical hocus-pocus Spinoza uses to armor his philosophical vulnerabilities. Ultimately, every great philosophical system is an involuntary, unconscious autobiography, a confession of its creator's deepest moral or immoral purposes. The various impulses within a scholar all vie for supremacy, each desperately wanting to establish itself as the legitimate lord and master of existence. Consider the noble Stoics, who proudly claim to live according to nature. This is a magnificent linguistic self-deception. Nature is boundlessly extravagant, indifferent, and devoid of pity or purpose. To live is to actively differentiate oneself from this indifference. It is to value, to prefer, and to limit. The Stoic does not truly read the law out of nature. Rather, driven by a tyrannical pride, he projects his own morality onto nature, demanding that the universe conform to his specific image. This is the eternal truth of all philosophy. It is the most spiritualized expression of the will to power, the imperious drive to create the world in one's own image. When we turn our attention to the modern epistemological debates concerning the real and apparent worlds, we sense a deep, underlying distrust. Those who stubbornly side against the evidence of the senses, viewing the physical world with puritanical suspicion, often betray a despairing, weary nihilism, a preference for a secure nothingness over an uncertain reality. They are fleeing from the chaotic bric-a-brac of modern positivism, seeking refuge in a realm that offers a semblance of ancient, comforting faith. We must look critically at the monumental pride Kant took in his discovery of synthetic judgments a priori. When he asked how such judgments were possible, his labyrinthine answer essentially boiled down to, by means of a specific faculty. This is no answer at all. It is the comedic equivalent of a physician claiming opium causes sleep by means of a dormitive virtue. We must shift our inquiry from the possibility of these judgments to the necessity of our belief in them, recognizing that they are fundamentally false judgments that we are nevertheless compelled to trust for our own preservation. Similarly, we must dismantle the lingering superstitions of physics. While Copernicus forced us to accept that the Earth moves despite what our eyes tell us, Boscovich delivered the fatal blow to materialistic atomism, teaching us to abandon the belief in solid matter and particles. Now, we must take the next step and eradicate soul atomism, the enduring Christian doctrine of an eternal, indivisible monad. The soul must be reconceptualized as a complex social structure of instincts and passions. Furthermore, psychologists must abandon the Spinozan error of crowning self-preservation as the cardinal instinct. A living creature seeks primarily to discharge its strength. Life itself is fundamentally the will to power, and mere survival is only a secondary consequence. The enduring belief in immediate certainties is a moral naivete. The assertion, "I think," is tangled in a web of unproven metaphysical assumptions, that there is an I that acts as a cause, that thinking is a distinct activity, and that we possess innate knowledge of what thinking actually is. A thought arrives when it chooses to, not when the I commands it. The concept of the will is similarly shrouded in popular prejudice. It is not a unified entity, but a highly complex orchestration of diverse sensations, ruling thoughts, and, crucially, the emotion of command. The illusion of free will stems from the commander identifying with the successful execution of the command by the body's myriad undersouls. We rejoice in the effect as if we directly caused it, a phenomenon akin to a ruling class taking credit for the successes of its commonwealth. The widespread reliance on concepts like causa sui is a logical absurdity, an arrogant attempt by man to pull himself out of the void by his own hair. We must abandon the mythological dualism of free and non-free will, recognizing that in reality there are only varying degrees of strong and weak wills. Even the physicist's proud assertion of nature's conformity to law is a naive, democratic interpretation, a bad piece of philology that projects human egalitarianism onto the cosmos. A bolder, more rigorous interpretation would see nature as the relentless, unexceptional enforcement of the will to power, devoid of any inherent laws or merciful constraints. Psychology has long been paralyzed by its own moral timidity, unable to face the terrifying depths of the human condition. It must now dare to chart the morphology of the will to power, confronting the unsettling reality that supposedly evil emotions like hatred, envy, and covetousness are essential life-conditioning forces. Only by sailing over the remnants of our comforting moralities can psychology reclaim its rightful throne as the queen of the sciences, paving the way to the most profound and fundamental problems of existence. Chapter 2. The Free Spirit. It is a profound source of wonder to observe how humanity exists upon a foundation of deliberate simplification and artificial clarity. We have forged a world that is easy to navigate by selectively ignoring its overwhelming complexities, granting our senses permission to engage only with the superficial. This foundational ignorance is not the opposite of knowledge, but rather its prerequisite. Our will to truth is built upon and refined from a much stronger underlying will to deception and uncertainty. Language itself traps us in this simplified reality by insisting on rigid opposites where there are only subtle gradations. The pursuit of philosophical knowledge therefore requires immense caution. Those who loudly martyr themselves for the sake of truth often lose the innocent neutrality of a genuinely free intellect. Becoming a public defender of a doctrine brutalizes the mind, turning the philosopher into an actor and an agitator. It is far wiser to retreat into the golden trellis work of a quiet garden, preserving one's intellectual grace by avoiding the poisonous resentment that arises from prolonged ideological warfare. The truly exceptional individual instinctively seeks a private citadel to escape the overwhelming presence of the average multitude. While prolonged immersion in the mundane and the cynical might be a necessary, albeit odious, phase for the philosopher's education, lingering there destroys the palate. To understand the depths of human motivation, one must occasionally listen to those who bluntly reduce mankind to a creature of basic appetites and vanities, for there is often more honesty in the unvarnished cynicism of the base than in the righteous indignation of the moralist. Yet, this elevated, rapid pace of free-spirited thought is inherently alienating. It is like a swift, dancing tempo that is almost impossible to translate into the ponderous, heavy rhythms of certain languages and cultures. To think with the breathless speed of the wind is a privilege of the strong, but it invites profound isolation. The path of independence is a labyrinth. Those who enter it multiply their life's dangers exponentially, risking a quiet, unseen destruction from which they can never return to the comforting sympathy of the crowd. Our most profound insights must inevitably appear as madness, or even criminality, to those who are not constitutionally prepared to receive them. The true distinction between the esoteric and exoteric is not merely inside versus outside, but a matter of vertical perspective, looking down from the heights versus gazing up from the valleys. The philosophical virtues of the higher man would spell ruin for the common man, and books written for the general public always carry the stifling odor of the herd. In our youth, we lack this capacity for nuance, attacking the world with absolute affirmations and denials. Only after enduring the self-inflicted torture of disillusionment do we learn the mature art of subtle distinction, realizing that our youthful, unconditional enthusiasm was itself a form of self-deception. Humanity's moral evolution has mirrored this trajectory. We existed first in a pre-moral age, where the value of an action was judged solely by its consequences. Over millennia, we shifted to a moral age, mistakenly locating an action's entire value in its conscious intention. We are now standing at the dawn of an ultra-moral era, recognizing that conscious intention is merely a superficial skin that conceals a vast, unconscious reality. The true, decisive value of any action lies precisely in what is unintentional. Consequently, we must ruthlessly interrogate all moralities of self-sacrifice and absolute altruism, suspecting them to be elaborate psychological deceptions. The belief that an idea is true simply because it brings comfort or promotes virtue is a dangerous fallacy. The fundamental nature of existence might be so harsh that enduring its unvarnished truth requires an extraordinary fortitude, and the truth may actually be fatal to weaker constitutions. If we accept that our world of passions and instincts is the only reality we can truly claim, we must logically attempt to explain all forces, even the mechanical, through this single framework. This leads to the radical proposition that all active force in the universe is fundamentally the will to power. Such a terrifying and profound worldview necessitates the use of masks. Every deep spirit requires a facade to navigate the world, and indeed, a mask naturally forms around them due to the perpetual superficial misunderstandings of the crowd. Sometimes, the most extravagant acts of goodness or vulnerability must be hidden behind a veil of coarseness or evasion. To prepare for this solitary and demanding existence, the free spirit must subject themselves to rigorous tests of independence. One must fiercely resist the urge to cleave to anything that might bind the soul, not to a beloved person, not to a fatherland, not to the seductions of a specialized science, and not even to the intoxicating feeling of one's own liberation. Conserving oneself through this radical detachment is the ultimate proof of mastery. From this crucible, a new order of philosophers is emerging. These tempters will absolutely reject the dogmatic desire to establish universal truths for all of mankind. Their truth will be entirely their own, fiercely protected by the conviction that the common good is a contradiction in terms, as anything common inevitably holds little value. These coming thinkers are the genuine free spirits, and they must never be confused with the democratic levelers who currently masquerade under that name. Those modern idealists seek only the comfortable bovine happiness of the herd, aiming to eliminate all suffering and enforce a stifling equality. We opposite ones understand that humanity has only ever achieved greatness through severity, danger, and the unconditioned will to power. The new philosophers will be investigators to the point of cruelty, thriving in their profound solitude, and willing to embrace the terrible, tyrannical, and predatory aspects of human nature as necessary catalysts for the elevation of the species. Chapter 3. The Religious Mood. The human soul, with its vast and uncharted territories, its unexplored heights and unfathomable depths, stands as the ultimate hunting ground for the born psychologist. Yet, the seeker of profound psychological truths often gazes into this dense primeval forest with a heavy heart, realizing the agonizing limitations of a single solitary mind. One might desperately wish for a retinue of skilled trackers and keen-scented hounds to drive the hidden secrets of the religious conscience out from the historical underbrush. But such assistance is a rare and improbable luxury. To truly comprehend the bruised and towering spiritual architecture of a mind like Pascal's, or to formulate the chaotic history of faith, the investigator must possess a wicked, unclouded clarity. Ultimately, the philosopher must venture into the wilderness alone, embracing the immense and dangerous labor of first-hand discovery, knowing that the pursuit of truth carries its own sublime rewards. When we examine the nature of early Christian faith, especially as it took root in the skeptical, philosophically seasoned soil of the ancient world, we do not find the simple, rustic devotion of the northern barbarians. The faith demanded by Christianity was, and remains, a continuous, agonizing suicide of reason. It is a terrifying subjection, a self-mutilation of the intellect designed for a highly refined and fastidious conscience. The ancient Roman mind, accustomed to noble tolerance, had never encountered a paradox as audacious and horrifying as the concept of a crucified deity. This doctrine was the ultimate act of Oriental vengeance against the classical world, a radical inversion of all established values. It was not merely faith that fueled the slaves' revolt, but a deep, simmering resentment against the emotional detachment and unshakable pride of the masters. The slave, suffering intimately and profoundly, demanded a tyrannical absolute, revolting against any aristocratic philosophy that sought to deny or dismiss pain. Throughout human history, the religious mood has frequently manifested alongside dangerous physiological disciplines, radical solitude, severe fasting, and sexual abstinence. We see a recurring pendulum swing in the human animal, where periods of sudden, explosive sensuality are immediately followed by violent spasms of penitence and world renunciation. The phenomenon of the saint has long paralyzed psychologists and philosophers alike. Schopenhauer, for instance, based his entire philosophical framework on the perplexing question of how the negation of the will, how the saint himself, was even possible. For centuries, observers stood in awe of the supposedly miraculous transformation of the wicked man into the holy man. But we must dare to ask whether this miracle is merely a clumsy error in interpretation, a psychological illusion born from the false belief that moral states exist in absolute opposition. Even the mightiest and most commanding figures of history have instinctively bowed before the ascetic. They did not bow out of pity for his frail, emaciated form, but because they sensed a terrifying hidden power. In the saint's monstrous self-denial, the rulers of the earth recognized an expression of their own unyielding will to power, a strength turned violently inward. They halted before the saint because they divined a dangerous, unconquered enemy, wondering if this extreme asceticism was the shadow of an even greater, unspoken authority. Consider the awe-inspiring magnitude of the Jewish Old Testament, a colossal monument of divine justice. In its pages, we encounter men, events, and a scale of existence so magnificent that the literature of ancient Greece and India shrinks in comparison. To stand before these literary ruins is to feel a profound reverence for the terrifying heights humanity once reached. It serves as a touchstone for greatness. How absurd, then, that this majestic text was stitched together with the New Testament, a book permeated with the neurotic, cloying atmosphere of the petty soul and the sentimental devotee. To bind these two fundamentally opposed works into a single authoritative Bible is perhaps the most audacious literary transgression ever committed in European history. If we turn our gaze to the present, we must ask, why is atheism now the dominant trajectory of the European spirit? It is not that the religious instinct is dead, rather the traditional theistic satisfaction has been rejected with deep suspicion. The concept of a fatherly, rewarding, and judging God has been thoroughly dismantled. Modern philosophy, from Descartes onward, has been covertly anti-Christian, wielding the tools of epistemological skepticism to assassinate the foundational concept of the soul. We have traversed a horrifying ladder of religious cruelty. In primitive times, mankind sacrificed its own flesh and blood to the gods. During the moral epoch, man sacrificed his own nature, joyfully turning the knife upon his strongest instincts. Now, in our modern era, we have reached the pinnacle of this dark progression. Man has sacrificed God himself, choosing instead out of an ultimate paradoxical cruelty to worship nothingness, gravity, and the blind mechanics of fate. And yet, if one possesses the courage to plunge into the absolute depths of this paralyzing pessimism, completely shedding the narrow constraints of traditional European morality, one might experience an unexpected awakening. By staring unflinchingly into the void of world renunciation, the philosopher might inadvertently open his eyes to the exact opposite ideal. He might envision the most exuberant, life-affirming individual imaginable, a spirit who not only accepts the triumphs and horrors of existence, but demands their eternal recurrence, crying out for the grand play to repeat itself forever. As the intellect's vision deepens, the solemn concepts of the past, such as God and sin, begin to look like the discarded toys of humanity's childhood, replaced by the heavier, more profound burdens of maturity. We must also observe how the modern environment actively dissolves the religious capacity. Genuine piety requires a certain aristocratic leisure, an idleness of both body and spirit. But the deafening, conceited laboriousness of the modern era, the relentless drive for industriousness, leaves no room for the quiet contemplation necessary for the coming of God. The modern scholar and the everyday worker view religion with a kind of dull, uncomprehending astonishment. The academic, armored in the smug superiority of his modern ideas, treats the religious individual with a patronizing tolerance, completely blind to the fact that his own enlightenment is built upon a profound superficiality. Indeed, men are inherently superficial out of a need for survival, and religion has historically been the most elaborate and beautiful falsification of reality, a vital defense mechanism crafted by those terrified of encountering the harsh, unvarnished truths of existence before they were strong enough to endure them. To love mankind merely for the sake of God is perhaps the most refined and distant sentiment ever achieved. Without a higher, divine anchor, such unconditional love would be little more than a naive and brutish folly. In the hands of a genuine philosopher, however, religion is never an end in itself. It is a powerful instrument for the education and elevation of humanity. For the strong and independent, the natural commanders, religion is a tool to govern, a means of binding the subjects to the rulers while offering the masses a sense of peace and justification for their ordinary, laborious lives. It casts a warming sunshine over the oppressed, making the hardships of their existence bearable. But a catastrophic toll is exacted when religion refuses to serve as a mere instrument and instead crowns itself as the sovereign master of human destiny. When faiths dedicated to the suffering and the downtrodden gain absolute control, they actively work to preserve that which natural law dictates should perish. By endlessly comforting the sick, the exhausted, and the defective, these religions have dragged the highest, most daring types of humanity down into a mire of bad conscience. in their mission to invert all noble values, to brand the love of the earth and the fierce drive for greatness as sinful. These paramount religions have stunted human evolution. They have labored for centuries to turn the magnificent potential of man into a sublime abortion, ultimately producing the weakened, domesticated, and herd-like European of our present age. Chapter 4. Apophthegms and Interludes. The nature of the true educator is such that he takes nothing truly seriously, not even his own being, except insofar as it relates to his students. Yet, as we pursue understanding, we must be wary of the alluring trap of seeking knowledge purely for its own sake. This is merely the final snare that traditional morality lays to entangle us once again. Indeed, the pursuit of knowledge would lose much of its captivating charm if there were not so much shame to be overcome along the treacherous path to its acquisition. Consider how dishonorably we treat the divine. We construct a God who is strictly forbidden to sin, holding him to an impossible and sterile standard. Similarly, when we observe a person who consistently allows himself to be degraded, exploited, and deceived, we might wonder if this is not a hidden divine diffidence moving among mankind. We must also recognize the inherent barbarity in loving only one person, or even in an exclusive love for God, for such devotion is always purchased at the agonizing expense of all others. Within the human psyche, a fierce battle wages between memory and pride. Memory asserts that a certain act was committed, while inexorable pride vehemently denies that it could have been the author of such an act. Ultimately, it is always the memory that surrenders. How carelessly we observe life if we fail to notice the hidden hand that strikes us down with paradoxical leniency. When an individual possesses a genuine character, they are destined to undergo a typical, recurring experience that defines their existence. The true sage, much like an astronomer, cannot truly possess the eye of the discerning investigator as long as he still looks up at the stars with a feeling of awe and inferiority. It is not the sudden, explosive intensity of profound sentiments that forges human greatness, but rather the enduring duration of those feelings. When one finally reaches their most cherished ideal, they inevitably surpass it in the very moment of attainment, rendering the goal obsolete. So much of human behavior is masked. Many a proud individual hides their truest nature from every passing eye, labeling this very concealment as their pride. The presence of genius is often a heavy burden to bear, and such a person is intolerable unless they are also graced with two essential counterweights: immense gratitude and an unblemished purity. Furthermore, a person's basest sensual nature inevitably reaches up to color and influence the highest altitudes of their intellectual and spiritual life. When the naturally militant spirit finds itself in an era of peace, it turns its aggression inward, attacking its own foundations. Principles, too, are rarely what they seem. A man employs his deepest beliefs either to dominate his surroundings, to justify his secret habits, to honor himself, to reproach his enemies, or to hide his true nature. Thus, two individuals professing the exact same principles may be driving toward entirely opposite ends. Even the man who despises himself fundamentally esteems himself precisely in his capacity as a despiser. When a soul knows it is deeply loved but feels no love in return, its most toxic sediment is stirred, bringing its darkest dregs to the surface. We must also acknowledge that once a mystery is fully explained, it ceases to hold any power over us. What did the ancient deity truly mean when he commanded humanity to know thyself? Perhaps it was a cruel injunction to cease caring about one's own internal machinations and to become coldly objective. It is a dreadful fate to die of thirst while surrounded by the vast ocean. Must we therefore heavily salt our philosophical truths until they can no longer quench the spiritual thirst of mankind? And what of this modern obsession with universal sympathy? To exercise pity for all creatures would invariably manifest as a harsh and tyrannical burden upon one's closest neighbors. Instinct operates with a powerful, overriding urgency. When a house is burning, one forgets entirely about the impending dinner, though the hunger will inevitably return to be satisfied among the ashes. In the realm of human relations, a woman learns the bitter art of hatred in exact proportion to her forgetting the art of charm. While the same fundamental emotions exist in both men and women, they operate at entirely different tempos, ensuring an eternal and tragic cycle of mutual misunderstanding. Behind the visible vanity of women lies a deep, impersonal scorn for the very concept of womanhood itself. When a free spirit deliberately binds their own heart, imprisoning their emotional life, they can afford to grant their intellect the wildest and most dangerous liberties. We instinctively begin to distrust incredibly clever individuals the moment they show signs of embarrassment or confusion. Furthermore, encountering truly dreadful and horrifying experiences forces us to question whether the person enduring them is not, at their core, something dreadful as well. Conversely, those with heavy, melancholic dispositions are often lifted to the buoyant surface of existence precisely by the very forces that drag others down, the fierce storms of hatred and love. We occasionally encounter individuals so utterly cold and icy that our fingers recoil as if burned upon touching them, leading the ignorant masses to mistakenly believe these frosty souls are red-hot with passion. Who among us has not, in a moment of weakness, sacrificed their truest self upon the altar of preserving a good reputation? There is a certain type of affability that harbors no active hatred for humanity, yet is saturated with a profound, unutterable contempt for it. True human maturity is not the shedding of childhood, but the difficult reacquisition of the absolute seriousness that a child brings to their play. To feel shame for one's immoral actions is merely a lower rung on the philosophical ladder. At the very top, one learns to feel a profound shame for one's rigid morality as well. We should endeavor to depart from this life, much as Ulysses departed from Nausicaa, offering a parting blessing rather than clinging to it in desperate, tearful love. When encountering a supposed great man, a piercing gaze often reveals merely a talented actor performing the script of his own fabricated ideal. The human conscience, when rigorously trained, has a peculiar habit of kissing us even as it bites down painfully. The profoundly disappointed individual listens intently for an echoing response from the world, only to hear the hollow, meaningless sound of empty praise. We all engage in the social deception of pretending to be much simpler than our true labyrinthine natures, utilizing this feigned simplicity to afford ourselves a moment of relaxation away from the exhausting demands of our peers. A truly discerning mind in the modern age might reasonably conclude that humanity is merely the tragic animalization of the divine. Chapter 4. Apophthegms and Interludes. The sudden realization of reciprocal love should, in a truly discerning mind, completely shatter the romantic illusion. The lover is forced to step back and question the beloved's judgment, asking whether she is truly modest enough or perhaps foolish enough to return such affection. This dynamic extends into the very fabric of human happiness, which often brings with it a terrifying sense of danger. When one is entirely content, embracing their destiny, they might arrogantly challenge the universe, asking who would dare to be their fate. Yet the passions we revere are often steeped in hidden impotencies. It is not an overwhelming love for humanity that prevents the modern zealot from burning dissenters at the stake, but rather the sheer impotence of their conviction. In the realm of deception, the pious fraud is far more repulsive to the truly free and knowledgeable spirit than the deliberate, impious lie. It reveals a profound lack of intellectual freedom and judgment. Music alone has the power to allow our deepest passions to truly enjoy themselves. But these passions are complex. When a strong character makes a firm resolution, it often demonstrates its power by willfully shutting its ears to the most brilliant counter-arguments. It adopts a deliberate and necessary stupidity to maintain its course. We must recognize a terrifying truth. There are no moral phenomena in this universe, only moral interpretations of phenomena. The criminal, for instance, is frequently unequal to the dark majesty of his own deed. He shrinks from it, extenuating and slandering his own actions. Rarely does his advocate possess the artistic vision to use the beautiful, terrifying nature of the crime to his client's advantage. Our internal emotional landscape is a battlefield where our vanity is most easily wounded just when our underlying pride has been struck. To the mind predestined for silent, solitary contemplation, the clamor of the faithful is an intolerable intrusion. He must actively guard his borders against the noisy, obtrusive believers who demand his participation. If you wish to prepossess someone in your favor, you need only display a touch of genuine embarrassment in their presence. Yet, in the grand theater of the sexes, expectations often ruin the play. The immense, breathless anticipation surrounding sexual love, combined with the coyness required to navigate it, entirely spoils a woman's perspective from the very beginning. Without the driving forces of love or profound hatred in the game, a woman's performance in life is resoundingly mediocre. There are defining, catastrophic epochs in our lives when we suddenly summon the courage to rebaptize our darkest, most wicked traits as our absolute best qualities. We deceive ourselves into thinking we possess a pure will to overcome our emotions, when in reality, this will is nothing more than the disguised dominance of another, stronger emotion taking command. There is a certain touching innocence in admiration, possessed only by the individual who has not yet realized that they, too, might one day be the object of someone else's admiration. Our disgust for our own spiritual dirt can become so overwhelming that it prevents us from ever attempting to cleanse or justify ourselves. Sensuality has a dangerous habit of accelerating the growth of love, forcing the blossom so rapidly that the roots remain weak and are easily torn from the earth. It is a curious and amusing thought that a divine being would bother to learn human language to become an author, and an even greater curiosity that he did not learn it better. Often, what we perceive as a deep vanity of the spirit, the visible rejoicing at receiving praise, is merely a superficial politeness of the heart. The institutions we revere often corrupt the natural order. Even the straightforward honesty of concubinage has been thoroughly corrupted by the rigid expectations of marriage. The martyr who exults at the burning stake does not necessarily triumph over the agony of the flames, but rather triumphs because he does not feel the specific pain he expected. He finds an ecstasy in the unexpected nature of his suffering. When forced to alter our high opinion of a person, we unconsciously charge them a heavy internal tax for the immense inconvenience they have caused our worldview. A nation, with all its monumental historical struggles, is merely nature's elaborate, circuitous detour to produce a half-dozen truly great individuals, and then to navigate her way around them. To the eyes of genuine women, the cold, penetrating gaze of science is deeply hostile to their innate sense of shame. They feel as though this relentless inquiry wishes to peer beneath their skin, or worse, beneath their carefully crafted finery. The more abstract the philosophical truth you wish to impart to the world, the more you must actively seduce the physical senses to embrace it. The devil, as the oldest and most relentless friend of knowledge, maintains the most expansive and complex perspectives regarding the divine, which is precisely why he keeps his distance. We truly discover what a person inherently is only when their specific talents begin to wane, when they can no longer mask their essence behind what they can perform. Talent is a magnificent adornment, but every adornment is simultaneously a profound concealment. The sexes exist in a state of perpetual, mutual deception. They do not truly love one another, rather, they love their own projected ideals. Man wishes for woman to be entirely peaceable, completely ignoring the fact that she is fundamentally and inherently unpeaceable, as wild and untamed as a feline, regardless of her domesticated demeanor. Ultimately, a man is punished most severely and effectively not for his sins, but for his highest virtues. He who lacks an ideal altogether lives a far more frivolous and shameless existence than the tragic figure who possesses an ideal but cannot find the path to reach it. All trustworthiness, all clear conscience, and all evidence of truth find their absolute origin in the raw, unfiltered evidence of the senses. Pharisaism, the rigid adherence to external virtue, is not a deterioration of the good man, but a necessary and essential condition for his very goodness. In the realm of intellect, one thinker desperately seeks a midwife for his nascent thoughts, while another searches for a mind he can assist. From this union, a truly great conversation is born. When navigating the company of scholars and artists, we frequently stumble into opposing errors. Behind the facade of a remarkable scholar, we often uncover a deeply mediocre man. Yet, behind the facade of a seemingly mediocre artist, we frequently discover a truly remarkable human being. Our waking interactions are much like our dreams. We invent and project the entire character of the person we are conversing with, and then we instantly forget the fabrication. Let it be known that in the arenas of both passionate love and bitter revenge, the female is infinitely more barbarous and savage than the male. Advice can be a dangerous riddle. If you wish to ensure a restraining band does not break, you must bite it first to secure it. The relentless daily demands of the human belly are the primary reason man does not immediately mistake himself for a god. The most chaste and profound utterance regarding passion dictates that in true love, it is the soul itself that completely envelops and consumes the body. Our vanity is a cunning creature. It desperately desires that the tasks we find most agonizingly difficult are perceived by the world as the things we do with the greatest, most natural ease. When a woman displays a pronounced inclination for scholarly and scientific pursuits, one can safely assume there is a fundamental derangement in her sexual nature. Barrenness itself paves the way for a more virile, masculine intellectual taste. Comparing the sexes on a grand scale, one could argue that woman would lack her unparalleled genius for aesthetic adornment if she did not possess a deep instinctual drive for the secondary, supportive role in existence. He who engages in prolonged battle with monsters must exercise the utmost caution, lest he inadvertently transform into a monster himself. If you gaze long and deeply into the dark abyss, the abyss will inevitably reach out and gaze into you. An ancient Florentine proverb wisely observes that both the good woman and the bad woman require the discipline of the stick. Who is more adept than a woman at the magical trick of seducing a neighbor into holding a wildly favorable opinion of her, and then implicitly believing that very opinion herself? What a particular era condemns as profound evil is usually nothing more than the unseasonable, lingering echo of what a previous epoch celebrated as the highest good, the sudden atavism of a dead ideal. Around the true hero, every event naturally twists itself into a tragedy. Around the demigod, existence becomes a chaotic satyr play, and around God himself, everything becomes, perhaps, a world. It is never sufficient merely to possess a great talent. One must also aggressively secure the permission of the world to exercise it. The most ancient and modern serpents of the world whisper the same seductive lie. Wherever the tree of knowledge stands, there also is paradise. But remember this. Whatever is done out of pure, unadulterated love always occurs entirely beyond the boundaries of good and evil. A joyous, intellectual distrust, an evasion of absolute claims, and a deep love of irony are the vital signs of a healthy, robust mind. Everything that demands absolute certainty belongs strictly to the ward of pathology. The capacity to feel the profound weight of tragedy increases and declines in direct proportion to one's sensuousness. While absolute insanity is a tragic rarity in the isolated individual, it is the undeniable, terrifying rule when it comes to groups, political parties, nations, and entire historical epochs. The very thought of suicide is a magnificent, comforting companion. It has successfully escorted many a desperate mind through the darkest and most agonizing of nights. We like to believe our reason and conscience rule us, but they merely truckle and bow to our strongest, most tyrannical emotional impulses. We feel a moral imperative to repay both the good and the ill we receive, but why must we repay it strictly to the specific individual who delivered it? A thinker rarely loves his own hard-won knowledge with the same fierce intensity once he has communicated it to the public. Poets are inherently shameless creatures. They ruthlessly exploit their own deepest experiences for the sake of their art. The comforting idea of loving our neighbor is a fallacy. Our true fellow creature is not our neighbor, but our neighbor's neighbor. So dictates the political logic of every nation. Love is a deceptive force. It brilliantly illuminates the most hidden, noble, and exceptional qualities of the lover, thereby completely obscuring their normal, everyday character. Jesus of Nazareth once radically declared to his followers that the strict law was meant only for servants. As sons of the divine, what have they to do with the heavy chains of morality? In the sight of every ideological movement, a shepherd must recognize that he requires a bellwether to lead the flock, or else he must occasionally lower himself to become the weather. One may successfully lie with the words of their mouth, but the accompanying grimace of the face will always betray the undeniable truth. To men of vigorous, overflowing vitality, true intimacy is simultaneously a matter of deep shame and a profoundly precious treasure. Christianity offered the god of love, Eros, a cup of poison. He did not die from the draught, but he was permanently degenerated into a vice. To talk endlessly about oneself is often the most effective and sophisticated method of absolute concealment. We find that the act of praising someone is often far more obtrusive and presumptuous than the act of blaming them. The application of pity to a truly knowledgeable and profound mind has a ludicrous, almost grotesque effect, much like placing delicate, tender hands upon the rugged form of a cyclops. We occasionally throw our arms around a single individual, pretending we do so out of a boundless love for all mankind because we cannot physically embrace everyone. But this is a dark secret we must never confess to the one we hold. We do not truly hate those we consider beneath us. Hatred is reserved strictly for those we esteem as our equals or our superiors. The utilitarian philosophers claim to love utility, but they merely use it as a convenient vehicle for their own hidden inclinations. In truth, they find the mechanical noise of its wheels entirely insupportable. Ultimately, humanity does not love the object of its desires. It is deeply and tragically in love with the feeling of desire itself. The vanity of another person only offends our taste when it directly contradicts and challenges our own vanity. Regarding the concept of absolute truthfulness, it is highly probable that no human being has ever possessed the capacity to be entirely truthful. We willfully refuse to believe in the obvious follies of incredibly clever men, which is a tragic forfeiture of our fundamental human rights. The brutal consequences of our past actions will always seize us violently by the forelock, utterly indifferent to the fact that we may have completely reformed our character in the interim. There is a specific kind of innocence in lying which serves as the ultimate proof of a person's absolute unwavering faith in their cause. It is a fundamentally inhuman expectation to demand that one should offer blessings while they are actively being cursed. The forced, unearned familiarity of superiors breeds a deep embitterment, precisely because it is a familiarity that cannot be safely returned. The true agony of deception is not the immediate pain of being lied to. It is the realization that because you have deceived me, I can never ever believe in you again. There is a specific, haughty manifestation of kindness that is indistinguishable from calculated wickedness. And finally, when asked why they harbor a deep dislike for another, has anyone ever possessed the sheer, terrifying honesty to answer, I dislike him because I am simply not a match for him? Chapter 5. The Natural History of Morals. The moral sentiment across Europe has achieved a remarkable subtlety and sensitivity, yet the academic science of morals remains remarkably awkward, presumptuous, and coarse-fingered. There is a glaring contradiction in the way modern moralists approach their subject. Rather than humbly acknowledging that their immediate task should be the careful collection, comparison, and classification of the immense variety of moral sentiments that have existed throughout history, these philosophers arrogantly demand of themselves a much higher and more ceremonious task. They all wish to discover the absolute basis of morality, taking the existence of morality itself as a given, unquestionable fact. They are completely blind to the reality that a true understanding of morals can only emerge from comparing many different moral systems. Because they are intellectually isolated within their own eras, churches, and climates, they view morality through a narrow, accidental lens. What they present as a newly discovered foundation for ethics is invariably just a scholarly expression of their unquestioning faith in the prevailing morality of their environment. Consider the naive earnestness of Schopenhauer, who honestly believed he had found the philosopher's stone of ethics in the simple, sentimental imperative to harm no one and help everyone. He entirely failed to realize that such an assertion is a fundamental absurdity in a world whose very essence is the will to power. Ultimately, every moral assertion, such as Kant's rigid categorical imperative, reveals far more about the psychologist who makes it than it does about the universe. Moral systems are, at their core, an elaborate sign language of the emotions. They are utilized by their creators to justify themselves, to achieve a state of tranquil self-satisfaction, to enact a disguised revenge, or to demand that all of humanity bow to the specific limitations that happen to bind the philosopher. If we look closely at the function of these moralities, we see that every system, in direct contrast to a state of unrestricted liberty, operates as a kind of tyranny against nature and reason. However, this is not a condemnation. The invaluable essence of every moral system is precisely that it acts as a prolonged, relentless constraint. Just as language achieves its highest elegance and power through the tyranny of metrical rules and poetic rhythm, human greatness has only ever been forged in the crucible of arbitrary laws. Every form of mastery, spiritual depth, artistic triumph, and refined virtue has flowered solely because the spirit voluntarily submitted itself to a long obedience in a single direction. The European mind has attained its current subtlety, its rigorous curiosity, and its intellectual strength strictly through centuries of bondage, by forcing itself to interpret the world through a singular, restrictive, and often absurd Christian framework. This long history of intellectual violence and severe discipline was an indispensable means of spiritual education. The moral imperative of nature itself commands that we must obey something, and obey it for a long duration, or else risk profound degradation and ruin. This inherent need for constraint is reflected even in the historical rhythms of human societies, where periods of explosive sensuality are necessarily interrupted by self-imposed fasts and intercalary days of severe restriction, allowing the passions to humble, purify, and sharpen themselves. We must critically examine the historical prejudices that have shaped our moral instincts. There is a deep plebeian utilitarianism echoing in the Socratism that Plato unconsciously absorbed, the doctrine that all evil is done out of ignorance, and that the good man is simply the one who recognizes what is useful to himself. This reflects the logic of the populace, who equate goodness strictly with utility and pleasantness. When we look at the eternal conflict between instinct and reason, we find that Socrates himself secretly laughed at the realization that he, like the noble Athenians he mocked, relied fundamentally on his instincts. Yet, with a characteristic falseness, he demanded that reason must be made to bow to and justify those very instincts. Since Plato, the entire trajectory of theology and philosophy has followed this path, laboring to prove that reason and instinct miraculously lead to the same divine goal. In reality, it is always the instinct, the voice of the herd, that has triumphed in these moral estimations. Our human senses, too, are deeply prejudiced. They are inherently hostile to the new and the strange. We find it vastly easier to fabricate an experience, to project a familiar image onto a novel event, than to undergo the arduous moral labor of genuinely perceiving what is different. We are, from our most fundamental roots, creatures accustomed to lying and artistic falsification, governed by emotions of fear, laziness, and desire, which dictate not only our waking interpretations, but the very landscapes of our dreams. The differences between human beings become most glaringly apparent in their varying conceptions of possession. To a modest man, the physical surrender of a woman may suffice as proof of ownership. A more ambitious and suspicious soul, however, demands far more. He requires that the woman sacrifice everything for him, that she know him completely, down to his most concealed devilry, and love him nonetheless. This instinct to appropriate, to mold others into our own image, manifests in the parent's dominion over the child, the teachers over the student, and the philanthropists over the needy. But the most profound and world-altering act of spiritual possession was enacted by the Jewish people, who achieved the miraculous inversion of valuations. They successfully fused the concepts of rich, powerful, and sensual with evil, while elevating the poor and the suffering to the status of the holy. With this radical inversion, the slave insurrection in morals truly began, shifting the entire trajectory of human history. As a direct consequence, the modern moralist harbors a deep, unacknowledged hatred for the untamed, tropical man of prey. The most vibrant, robust, and formidable human specimens are feverishly branded as morbid or hellish simply because they threaten the safety of the temperate, mediocre herd. Almost all modern moral systems are nothing more than elaborate recipes for safety, dictated by timidity. They seek to neutralize the dangerous passions, lowering the human emotional landscape to a lukewarm, innocent mean, desperately trying to protect the weak from the terrifying exuberance of life. Throughout the entirety of human existence, men have always lived in herds, tribes, communities, and churches, where the vast majority obey and only a very few command. Consequently, the instinct for obedience has been cultivated in humanity more deeply and persistently than any other trait. We now carry within us a formal, innate conscience that hungers for commands, eagerly accepting whatever orders are shouted at it by society, state, or public opinion. The tragic result of this overwhelming herd instinct is the gradual erosion of the true commander. In modern Europe, the commanding class suffers from a profound bad conscience. They can only justify their authority by pretending they are not truly leading, but merely executing the will of the law, the constitution, or the people. They disguise their power under the humble title of first servants of the state. Meanwhile, the gregarious European flatters himself, believing that his herd virtues, sympathy, modesty, industry, and equality are the only legitimate human qualities. Yet the deep, unspoken desperation of this masterless herd is occasionally revealed when an absolute ruler, like Napoleon, suddenly appears, offering an immense, intoxicating deliverance from the unbearable weight of aimless equality. In our modern age of dissolution and racial blending, where individuals inherit a chaotic warfare of contradictory instincts, the average man is fundamentally weak. His highest desire is for this internal war to cease. His ultimate conception of happiness is a narcotic repose, an uninterrupted, peaceful slumber. However, when these same contradictory, warring instincts are inherited by a nature possessing an extraordinary capacity for self-control, the result is the emergence of marvelously enigmatic, unconquerable men, beings like Alcibiades, Caesar, or Leonardo da Vinci. These magnificent exceptions arise from the exact same societal conditions that produce the exhausted, peace-seeking majority. Yet the morality of the modern herd actively suppresses such greatness. As long as a community feels threatened by external enemies, it values the harsh, aggressive, and dangerous instincts of its strongest members. But the moment the community feels secure, the morality of fear takes command. The very qualities that once saved the group, ambition, foolhardiness, and a thirst for power, are now perceived as internal threats to equality and are violently condemned as evil. The ultimate goal of this gregarious morality is to reach a state where there is absolutely nothing more to fear. It demands the systematic softening of justice, viewing all punishment as inherently cruel and unfair, entirely siding with those who suffer, even if they are criminals. We must ruthlessly recognize that the morality dominating Europe today is strictly the morality of the herding animal. It arrogantly believes itself to be the only valid ethical framework, fiercely defending itself against the possibility of any higher, more rigorous moralities. The democratic movement, alongside its more impatient, teeth-gnashing shadow, the anarchist movement, is the direct inheritor of this paralyzing Christian ideology. They are united in their deep hostility to any society that demands hierarchy, in their violent rejection of special privileges, and above all, in their absolute, almost feminine intolerance for suffering. They dream of a future where all pain is eliminated, completely oblivious to the fact that they are engineering a profound deterioration of the human species. We opposite ones, who recognize that humanity's greatest advancements have only ever been forged through severity, danger, and the unconditioned will to power, must place our hopes in the emergence of new philosophers. We await commanders of the spirit who will transvalue these decaying values and prepare humanity for its greatest tasks. For the thinker who fully grasps the agonizing possibility that mankind is actively dwarfing itself into a harmless, perfectly equal and hopelessly mediocre herd animal, knows a profound loathing and a terrifying anxiety that the rest of the world cannot even begin to comprehend. Chapter 6. We Scholars. There is a subtle, almost unnoticed revolution occurring in the modern hierarchy of knowledge, a dangerous inversion of rank that demands urgent and forceful protest. The modern man of science has declared his independence, violently emancipating himself from the dominion of philosophy. This arrogant uprising is merely another symptom of our era's democratic disorganization. The intellectual plebeian, armed with his specialized tools, now seeks to dictate terms to the masters of thought. The specialist, the academic laborer, flush with the triumphs of empirical discovery, looks upon the grand, synthetic tasks of the philosopher with an instinctive, defensive hostility. In the corridors of modern universities, one constantly encounters this breathtaking insolence. The mere technician of knowledge, resentful of any authority that reaches beyond his narrow discipline, attempting to crown himself as the ultimate arbiter of truth. This anti-philosophical prejudice often stems from the bitter aftertaste left by the flawed, all-too-human philosophers of the recent past. When the philosophical throne is occupied by confused amalgamators and pessimistic ideologues, it is hardly surprising that the industrious scientist feels a surge of superior pride. Yet, this pride is fundamentally misplaced. The scholar's revolt is the revolt of the intellectual mob, a desperate attempt to abolish the master and reduce all profound inquiry to a safe, manageable, and highly specialized trade. The true philosopher faces a labyrinth of perils in the modern age, a path so choked with the sprawling, towering architecture of the sciences that it is a miracle if he reaches maturity at all. The sheer volume of knowledge threatens to exhaust him before his journey has truly begun. He risks becoming a mere millipede of learning, halting his ascent to specialize in some obscure corner of existence, thereby losing his capacity for the sweeping, eagle-eyed perspective that his calling demands. If he escapes the trap of specialization, he may arrive at his supreme elevation too late, when his vital energies are already waning and his boldest instincts have been dulled. The genuine philosopher is forced to navigate a harrowing psychological landscape. He is burdened with the agonizing duty of passing a final judgment upon life itself, a terrifying yea or nay that requires him to endure the most shattering, profoundly disturbing experiences. Unlike the cautious academic who safely catalogues facts from a distance, the philosopher must risk his very self in the treacherous game of existence. It is a profound tragedy that the public perpetually confuses this daring, dangerously unprudent figure with the quiet, safely detached scholar, or worse, with the religiously intoxicated visionary seeking an escape from the world. To understand the vast gulf separating the genuine creator from the mere man of learning, one must ruthlessly dissect the psychology of the average scholar. The scientific man is, at his core, a profoundly commonplace individual. He is defined not by his commanding vision, but by his amiable, unthreatening virtues, industry, patient subordination, and a desperate need for the comforting proximity of his peers. He thrives in the safe, green pastures of the academic herd, requiring the constant, reassuring sunshine of public recognition to quiet the gnawing distrust that always plagues dependent natures. The scholar is riddled with the ignoble maladies of mediocrity. He harbors a petty, vigilant envy, possessing a lynx-like vision for the flaws and vulnerabilities of those elevated spirits whose heights he can never hope to scale. Confronted by a truly immense, rushing river of genius, the scholar's soul turns to a sheet of smooth, unresponsive ice. He instinctively wields the subtle, Jesuitical weapon of the mediocre, a gentle, considerate, but relentless effort to relax every tautly drawn string, to suffocate the exceptional individual under a blanket of paralyzing sympathy. We must completely dismantle the modern idolatry of the objective spirit. While the flawless, depersonalized intellect of the ideal scientist is certainly a magnificent and costly instrument, it remains merely an instrument, a tool meant to be wielded by a far more powerful hand. The purely objective man has surrendered his own essence. He has become nothing more than a highly sensitive mirror, waiting passively to reflect whatever phenomena pass before him. He no longer possesses a central driving purpose. He cannot summon the fierce elemental forces of love or hatred. He receives all things with a terrifying, indiscriminate hospitality, losing himself in the endless stream of data. If one seeks genuine passion from him, one finds only an awkward, artificial pantomime. The objective scholar knows neither how to creatively affirm nor how to ruthlessly destroy. He is a magnificent vessel devoid of its own content, a selfless void, an exquisite measuring device that entirely lacks the imperious, commanding gravity of a true master. When the modern intellectual frantically avoids any definitive assertion, retreating into the mild, lulling comforts of skepticism, he reveals a profound physiological exhaustion. This widespread paralysis of the will is the direct consequence of Europe's frantic blending of disparate classes, races, and inherited moralities. The modern soul is a chaotic battleground of conflicting values, resulting in an overwhelming spiritual fatigue that disguises itself beneath the elegant, evasive masks of objectivity and pure science. This disease of the will ravages Western Europe, leaving its most civilized nations trembling at the mere thought of absolute conviction. Yet while the West languishes in this hesitant twilight, an immense, unbroken and terrifying reservoir of will silently gathers in the vast Asiatic expanses of the Russian Empire, a will that waits patiently for its moment to strike. The only possible salvation for Europe from its own paralyzing doubt and from the looming shadow of the East would be the sudden forging of a singular continental will, a new, commanding caste capable of aiming its ambitions centuries into the future, finally ending the petty, squabbling comedy of modern democratic politics. There is, however, a vastly different, infinitely more dangerous species of skepticism, a hardened, martial doubt that belongs to the fearless, conquering spirit. This masculine skepticism does not paralyze, it emancipates. It ruthlessly undermines and dissects, granting the intellect a terrifying, boundless liberty while fiercely guarding the iron discipline of the heart. This is the intellectual courage that will define the philosophers of the future. These impending tempters and commanders will undoubtedly wield the scalpel of criticism with a cold, almost cruel delight. They will subject the most sacred dogmas to agonizing experiments, entirely indifferent to whether their truths bring comfort, elevation, or despair to the sentimental masses. Yet they will fiercely reject the modern tendency to reduce philosophy to mere criticism. To claim that the philosopher is nothing more than a critical scientist is to profoundly insult the philosophical calling. We must enforce a rigid, absolute distinction between the philosophical laborer and the genuine philosopher. Great scholars like Kant and Hegel are magnificent intellectual workers whose task is to gather, formalize, and systematize the sprawling, chaotic value systems of the past. They build massive, imposing architectures out of what humanity has already lived and believed. But the genuine philosophers are not mere cataloguers of the past. They are the absolute commanders and lawgivers of the future. They do not merely analyze what is, they decree what shall be. Their towering intellect reaches out and grasps the future with a creative, tyrannical hand, using the entirety of human history as a mere anvil upon which to forge their new ideals. For these sovereign spirits, the pursuit of truth is not a passive reflection of reality. It is the ultimate, unapologetic expression of the will to power. Because of this terrifying, world-altering mission, the true philosopher is fundamentally condemned to be the enemy of his own era. His agonizing but magnificent destiny is to serve as the bad conscience of his age, plunging the vivisector's knife directly into the heart of his generation's most comfortable and cherished virtues. He exposes the hypocrisy, the hidden decay, and the profound cowardice lurking beneath the pious moralities of his time. In an age that furiously attempts to level all human greatness, to reduce mankind to a harmless, equalized herd of perfectly comfortable animals, the philosopher must embody the absolute antithesis. True greatness now demands an unprecedented capacity for profound, unyielding solitude. It requires the strength to stand entirely apart, to bear the crushing weight of supreme responsibility without the comforting illusion of a sympathetic crowd. This exalted, isolated existence cannot be taught in any university. It is the culmination of generations of severe aristocratic discipline, an inherited blood-deep instinct where the rigors of profound thought are not experienced as a sweaty, burdensome toil, but as a spontaneous, triumphant, and divine dance over the abyss. Chapter 7. Our Virtues. It is highly probable that we modern Europeans, the restless firstlings of the 20th century, still possess our own peculiar virtues. They are certainly not the massive, uncomplicated virtues of our grandfathers, which we now view with a mixture of distant respect and mild amusement. If we, with our dangerous curiosity and sweetened cruelty, are to lay claim to any virtues at all, they must be those that have survived the labyrinth of our most secret inclinations. Is it not a charming endeavor to search for one's own virtues, almost a return to the old-fashioned comfort of a good conscience? We may laugh at the grandfatherly pigtail of moral certainty, but in our desperate search for a defining excellence, we reveal ourselves as the worthy heirs of those self-assured ancestors. Yet, our moral firmament is far more complex. We are like a planet illuminated by multiple suns of different colors. Our actions are bathed in shifting, motley lights, driven by a chaotic blend of competing moralities. We have, for instance, learned the art of loving our enemies, but we do so by learning to despise precisely when we love best. This is a quiet, unostentatious goodness, entirely opposed to the pompous, theatrical morality of the past. The puritanical litanies and the self-righteous posturing of formal virtue now offend our modern taste. Our intellectual dance requires a different rhythm. We must be exceptionally wary of those who parade their moral tact. The moment we make a misstep in their presence, these supposedly sensitive souls become our most instinctive detractors, unable to forgive us for shattering their delicate illusions. It is far better to study the unconscious astuteness of the mediocre. The bourgeois mind possesses a subtle Jesuitical malice that it wields against any spirit that dares to elevate itself. This instinct for leveling is perhaps the most intelligent force operating in society today. If the psychologist wishes to witness a truly divine spectacle of malice, he need only observe how the good, well-meaning people subconsciously labor to destroy the exceptional individual. The compulsion to judge and condemn morally is the ultimate revenge of the intellectually shallow. Lacking natural endowments, the mediocre seek compensation by dragging the gifted down to the courtroom of moral equality. They frantically champion the idea that all are equal before God, for without such a divine equalizer, their inferiority would be undeniable. To suggest to them that a lofty, refined spirituality is infinitely superior to mere moral respectability would incite a furious rage. They cannot fathom that true spiritual elevation is the hard-won synthesis of generations of severe discipline, a majestic justice that recognizes the absolute necessity of a hierarchy of rank among men. When we hear the modern chorus singing the praises of disinterestedness and unselfishness, we must rigorously question what these people are actually interested in. The average man simply cannot comprehend the passions and tasks that consume higher natures. To him, such devotions appear utterly detached from normal human desires. But no action driven by love or the urge to sacrifice is ever truly unselfish. The one who sacrifices always demands a return, perhaps an elevated sense of self, a feeling of greater power, or the satisfaction of an internal ideal. The insistence that a single unegoistic morality should apply universally is an arrogant sin against good taste. It is an insidious trap designed to seduce and cripple the rarer, more privileged types of humanity. Moral systems must be forced to bow before the undeniable gradations of rank, abandoning the immoral pretense that what is right for the herd is proper for the master. Listen closely to the modern preachers of universal sympathy, and beneath their noisy rhetoric you will hear the hoarse, unmistakable groan of self-contempt. The cultured European is deeply dissatisfied with himself, and his obsession with pity is merely a symptom of this profound spiritual sickness. In his desperation, the modern hybrid man desperately tries on the historical costumes of past eras. Our 19th century has developed a unique historical sense, a capacity to quickly divine and mimic the values of past cultures. Plunged into a democratic mingling of bloodlines, we have become a chaotic repository of ancient instincts. We possess an ignoble plebeian curiosity that allows us to enjoy the semi-barbarism of Shakespeare, or the vibrant paradoxes of Homer, lacking the strict exclusive taste that characterized truly noble epochs. While this historical adaptability makes us unpretentious and patient, it also renders us fundamentally incapable of creating or even fully appreciating the ultimate sunlit perfection of a self-sufficient, finalized culture. We are semi-barbarians who feel most alive only when we are teetering on the edge of the boundless and the dangerous. All those philosophical systems, whether utilitarianism, hedonism, or pessimism, that measure the value of existence by the superficial metrics of pleasure and pain are mere naivetes. The creative spirit looks down upon these philosophies with a mixture of scorn and profound pity. Our sympathy, however, is radically different from the pity of the herd. When the modern visionary dreams of eradicating all suffering, we view this ambition with indescribable anguish. We understand that the discipline of great, agonizing suffering is the sole forge that has ever produced human elevation. It is the terrifying tension of the soul in misfortune that crystallizes its strength, its inventiveness, and its ultimate grandeur. Man is both the unformed clay and the divine sculptor. To eliminate the suffering of the raw material is to destroy the possibility of the masterpiece. Our sympathy is directed toward the creator within man, who must necessarily suffer the blows of the hammer to be fashioned into greatness. We who proudly bear the title of immoralists are not free from duty. We are tightly bound by our own rigorous standards, dancing in our invisible chains, constantly pushing ourselves against the limits of our own endurance. Our sole remaining virtue is our uncompromising honesty. We must fiercely protect this intellectual conscience from deteriorating into a mere pose or a tedious habit. We must call upon all our inner devils, our sense of danger, our mocking skepticism, our fastidious curiosity, to prevent our honesty from becoming the dull moralistic vanity of a saint. We need only look at the English utilitarians to see the horrifying results of tedious moralizing. With their ponderous, respectable strides, they attempt to reduce all ethical striving to the pursuit of comfort and middle-class happiness. They are entirely blind to the fact that the general welfare is a phantom, and that true virtue is inextricably linked to the distinct rank of the individual. It is time to shatter the comforting illusion that higher culture has successfully slain the wild beast within humanity. The beast has not perished. It has merely been transfigured. The foundation of all elevated culture is the spiritualization of cruelty, the ecstatic thrills of tragedy, the agonizing self-mutilation of the religious ascetic, and even the relentless dissecting gaze of the modern philosopher all draw their profound sweetness from the hidden wellsprings of cruelty. The true seeker of knowledge operates as an artist of cruelty against his own spirit, forcing himself to accept harsh, unvarnished truths that continually violate his heart's deepest desires. The intellect inherently desires a simplified, easily digestible world, longing for the comfort of ignorance and comforting illusions. But the rigorous conscience of the free spirit relentlessly tears away these veils, preferring the terrifying original text of nature to the glittering, reassuring lies painted over it by millennia of moral superstition. Beneath our acquired learning lies a bedrock of spiritual fate, an unteachable granite of fundamental convictions. When we touch upon these deepest strata, we inevitably confront the eternal problem of man and woman. The modern feminist movement, which insists upon educating men about woman as she is a tragic symptom of Europe's general degradation. By attempting to cast off her natural instincts and mimic the independence of the male scholar, woman is actively defeminizing herself. She is abandoning her most potent weapons, her cunning, her enchanting flexibility, and the delightful, terrifying wildness that has historically captivated and dominated man. The drive for equal rights and economic independence is an almost masculine stupidity that strips woman of her mystique. When woman ceases to fear man, she loses her unique power to inspire the profound protective reverence that has always characterized the noble dynamic between the sexes. A thinker who genuinely possesses depth must view this relationship with the unyielding rationality of the ancient Orientals. Woman is inherently predestined for a different sphere of existence, and to dream of equal training and equal claims is to betray a catastrophic shallow-mindedness. The tragic irony of the modern era is that precisely when men have begun to treat women with unprecedented democratic respect, women have begun to lose their innate taste and modesty. They demand to be clerks and political actors, entirely forgetting that their historical supremacy was forged not in the sterile classrooms of enlightenment, but in the veiled, instinctual arts of their own nature. To force woman into the glaring light of modern equality is to rob her of the very essence that makes her the beautiful, dangerous, and enigmatic counterforce to man. Chapter 8. Peoples and Countries. When one listens closely to the grand, heavy, and magnificent tapestry of Wagner's late art, one hears the very essence of the German soul. It is a music that arrogantly assumes centuries of musical heritage, blending the ancient with the bitterly modern, the coarse with the artificially refined. It lacks the sunlit grace and the dancing logic of the South, offering instead a cumbersome, chaotic, and inexhaustible depth. This sonic landscape perfectly mirrors the German spirit itself, a spirit that belongs simultaneously to the distant past and the unseen future, but tragically possesses no actual present. Even those of us who strive to be good Europeans occasionally suffer from brief, nostalgic fevers of patriotism, falling back into the narrow anxieties of our fatherlands. We witness our statesmen engaging in the brutal, noisy theater of high politics, forcing their nations to sacrifice their quiet, reliable virtues for the sake of a massive, vulgar power. Yet, while one nation may temporarily shallow itself out in the pursuit of empire, the overarching physiological reality of our age cannot be stopped. The slow, inevitable blending of Europeans into a supranational nomadic species. While this relentless democratization breeds a vast herd of adaptable, weak-willed, and easily managed subjects, it simultaneously cultivates the exact conditions necessary for the emergence of dangerously strong, exceptional individuals. The leveling of the masses is, ironically, the perfect involuntary breeding ground for the tyrants and spiritual commanders of the future. The fabled German depth is a phenomenon that requires ruthless dissection. It is not a cleanly built architecture, but rather an entangled cavernous labyrinth resulting from a profoundly chaotic mixture of ancient bloodlines and conflicting races. The German is fundamentally elusive. He is never fully formed, but is perpetually becoming, constantly dragging his soul through unresolved contradictions. This love for the obscure, the evolving, and the clouded is perhaps best understood not as profound wisdom, but as a kind of spiritual indigestion. Yet this very clumsiness and lack of polished taste provide a dangerous Mephistophelian disguise, allowing the German to mask his sudden, terrifying intellectual daring beneath a veneer of honest, good-natured simplicity. In the realm of art, the German trajectory has been a steady retreat from a unified European taste. While Mozart's music captured the fading aristocratic echo of a refined century, Beethoven acted as a magnificent bridge to the romantic, revolutionary spirit. But by the time of Schumann, German music had shrunk into a petty, dangerous lyricism, losing the grand voice of the European soul and deteriorating into a merely national affair. Similarly, the German relationship with literature reveals a profound physiological deafness. The modern German reads exclusively with the eye, entirely disconnected from the breathing, physical rhythm of the spoken word. They are blind to the strict, dancing tempo of a finely crafted period, an art form revered in antiquity, which in Germany has only ever found a fleeting home in the pulpit eloquence of Luther's Bible. In the grand historical division of genius, certain nations, like the Greeks and the French, are designed by nature to be the engendering forces of culture, perfectly shaping and finalizing their artistic forms. Other nations, like the Romans, the Germans, and the Jews, are driven by an insatiable, restless desire to be fructified, to constantly push beyond themselves and absorb foreign elements. Every nation possesses its own characteristic hypocrisy, fundamentally blind to its own deepest nature. When we turn our gaze to the Jews, we must recognize that Europe owes them an unparalleled debt: the introduction of the grand style into morality, the terrifying majesty of infinite demands, and the seductive romantic allure of absolute moral questionableness. In the face of the petty, diseased nationalisms currently infecting the continent, most notably the foolish and distasteful anti-Semitic outbursts, we must acknowledge that the Jews are the strongest, most resilient race in modern Europe. They do not plot domination. They merely desire to be absorbed and to end their endless wandering. A genuinely far-sighted European statesmanship would actively seek to integrate this profound, enduring force, wedding their unparalleled genius for wealth and patience to the hereditary martial disciplines of the continent, thereby forging a new, commanding caste. In stark contrast, the English are a fundamentally unphilosophical race. Through thinkers like Bacon, Hobbes, Hume, and Locke, they have systematically degraded the philosophical spirit, reducing it to a mechanical, utilitarian mechanism. The Englishman, inherently gloomy, sensual, and brutal, desperately requires the strict, moralizing discipline of Christianity to tame his baser instincts. What offends most in the English spirit is its total lack of musicality, its absolute failure to move with rhythm or dance. It is a profound tragedy that the respectable, heavy-footed mediocrity of English thinkers like Darwin and Mill has recently come to dominate European taste. This scientific reductionism falsely equates the diligent gathering of commonplace facts with the majestic creative task of the true philosopher. This English plebeianism of modern ideas actively poisons the European soul, standing in direct opposition to the genuine nobility of sentiment and taste that was historically the magnificent invention of France. Despite its current vulgarization by a noisy democratic bourgeoisie, France remains the spiritual home of Europe's most refined culture. The true inheritors of this tradition keep themselves hidden, protecting their exquisite sensitivity from the delirious bad taste of the mob. They maintain their historical superiority through an unwavering devotion to artistic form, a delicate, moralistic curiosity that the German mind cannot even begin to comprehend, and a brilliant physiological synthesis of the melancholic North and the vibrant South. A true seeker of knowledge must cultivate this southern spirit, longing for a super-European music that escapes the grey conceptual fogs of the North, a music that embraces the fierce, sunlit wilderness of existence. Despite the artificial, short-sighted policies of modern statesmen who attempt to divide nations with the madness of nationalism, the deepest, most irresistible current of our era demands that Europe become one. The greatest, most comprehensive minds of our century, figures like Napoleon, Goethe, Beethoven, Stendhal, and Schopenhauer, were all secretly laboring to forge this magnificent synthesis. They were the bold, high-flying pioneers of a new humanity, reaching out beyond the claustrophobia of their fatherlands to embrace the profound and terrifying destiny of the good European. Chapter 9. What is noble? Every monumental elevation of the human species has always been, and will fundamentally always be, the exclusive work of an aristocratic society. It requires a society that instinctively believes in a long, unyielding scale of gradations of rank and differences of worth among men, a society that practically necessitates slavery in some form or another. Without the pathos of distance, that enduring, agonizing chasm forged by the ruling caste as they gaze down upon their subjects and instruments, that other, vastly more mysterious pathos could never have taken root. I speak of the craving for an ever-widening distance within the soul itself, the continuous development of higher, rarer, and more comprehensive states of being. We must ruthlessly strip away our humanitarian illusions regarding the origins of such a society. The truth is stark and terrifying. Every higher civilization began with men who possessed a nature that was still entirely natural. These were barbarians in the most terrible and magnificent sense of the word, men of prey armed with an unbroken strength of will and an insatiable lust for power, who hurled themselves upon weaker, more civilized or more peaceful races. The noble caste was, at its inception, the barbarian caste. Their superiority lay not primarily in their physical strength, but in their psychical power. They were, in the most profound sense, more complete men, and consequently more complete beasts. To shrink from this reality is to deny the essential character of life. We must dare to face the universe down to its deepest, most uncompromising foundations. Life itself is essentially appropriation, injury, the conquest of the strange and the weak, suppression, severity, the obtrusion of its own forms, and at the very least, exploitation. The modern democratic attempt to build a society upon the principle of mutual non-interference is a tragic symptom of physiological decay, a disguised will to nothingness. A truly living, healthy body must necessarily be an incarnate will to power. It will constantly strive to grow, spread, and seize dominion, not out of any moral depravity or conscious wickedness, but simply because it lives, and life intrinsically is the will to power. The corruption of a magnificent aristocracy begins the moment it loses its good conscience regarding this fundamental law, when it begins to feel that its existence is an injustice and timidly surrenders its absolute privileges to the demands of the herd. A healthy aristocracy must accept with a profound, terrifying calm the sacrifice of a legion of individuals who must be suppressed and reduced to incomplete men, to mere tools and slaves, in order for the ruling caste to elevate itself. Wandering through the myriad moral systems of human history, one inevitably discovers two fundamental, opposing types: master morality and slave morality. In the morality of the ruling class, the distinction between good and bad is entirely synonymous with noble and despicable. The noble type of man experiences himself as the absolute determiner of values. He does not seek approval, he decrees. He instinctively feels, "What is injurious to me is injurious in itself." He is a creator of values, honoring whatever he recognizes in himself, demanding a proud reverence for his own strength, severity, and capacity for deep, enduring friendships. In this aristocratic worldview, duties exist strictly among equals. Toward beings of a lower rank, toward all that is foreign, one may act as one's heart dictates, completely beyond good and evil. Pity, when it occasionally manifests in the master, is never a frantic, nervous response to suffering, but rather a luxurious, almost careless overflow of supreme power. Conversely, consider the moral perspective of the oppressed, the suffering, and those fundamentally weary of existence. What is the defining character of their moral valuations? It is a pessimistic suspicion directed against the entire condition of human life. The slave's eye is inherently resentful of the virtues of the powerful. He possesses a deep-seated skepticism and seeks to convince himself that the happiness of the masters is a cruel illusion. In slave morality, the qualities that alleviate the existence of the suffering are aggressively brought into the glaring light and elevated as the highest, most absolute virtues. Sympathy, the kind and helping hand, the warm heart, patience, industry, and humility. Here, the good man must necessarily be the safe man. He must be good-natured, easily deceived, unthreatening, and perhaps a bit stupid. To the slave, the concept of evil is inevitably attached to the powerful, the dangerous, the terrifying, and the unpredictable. It is the tragic triumph of the slave insurrection in morals that the most dangerous and magnificent human qualities have been branded as wicked, while the cautious, protective instincts of the herd have been consecrated as divine. The profound, unbridgeable chasm between the noble soul and the plebeian mind becomes agonizingly clear in their divergent relationships to vanity and reverence. The noble man instinctively seeks to impose his own high estimation of himself upon others. His worth is self-generated. The vain man, however, desperately seeks to extract his sense of worth from the opinions of the crowd, completely dependent on the external validation he can successfully solicit. It is a fundamental instinct of the noble soul to revere what is ancient and established, to feel a profound gratitude toward its ancestors and a harsh, uncompromising severity toward the present generation. But the most distinguishing, infallible mark of true nobility is its capacity for profound reverence for itself. The higher philosophical man demands a terrible cleanliness of the spirit, a fastidious distance from the coarse, the sweaty, and the familiar. Because of this agonizing sensitivity, the noble soul must inevitably walk through life heavily disguised. A profound thinker is constantly surrounded by a mask, partly because of his own deliberate concealment, but primarily due to the constant shallow misunderstandings of the multitude who force his actions into their own petty frameworks. The solitary wanderer who dares to scale these philosophical heights must eventually face the ultimate tragic realization regarding his own thought. As he ventures deeper into the labyrinth of the Dionysian spirit, communing with that great hidden tempter god who constantly forces the soul to test its own strength, he begins to see the terrifying, beautiful cruelty of existence. Yet the moment he attempts to capture these wild, dancing thoughts in language, to immortalize them in written words, he is overcome by a profound, melancholy sorrow. For what is it that we actually write down? We can only ever capture those ideas that have already begun to lose their vitality, those thoughts that have grown tired, heavy, and ripe. We immortalize what is already on the verge of dying. Even the most soaring, wicked, and vibrant philosophical insights, once pinned to the page, risk transforming into absolute rigid truths, losing the wild, immortal life they possessed when they first struck the solitary mind like lightning over the abyss.